Assalamu alaikum. Hope all of you are fine. This is our fourth lecture of the development of. In this lecture, we'll discuss the development of the diencephalon, which includes the thalamus, hypothalamus, epithalamus, pineal gland, and the cavity of the diencephalon, which is the third ventricle. The forebrain vesicle give rise to the two swellings, the rostral swelling, which is called the diencephalon, and these two lateral diverticula, they give rise to the cerebral hemisphere, which we have discussed in the previous lecture. The median and the caudal swelling is the diencephalon. The optic vesicles, they emerge as an outpocketings or the outgrowths from the cavity of the diencephalon. So we'll discuss in this lecture the structures which are formed from the diencephalon. The diencephalon, the caudal and the median part, it will give rise to the optic cup, the pituitary gland, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the epiphysis. This green area is showing you the adult structures of the diencephalon, which is formed between the cerebral hemisphere and the midbrain. And it includes the thalamus, hypothalamus, the epithalamus, and the subthalamus. The diencephalon, which is a median swelling, its lateral walls, they thickens and they give rise to the alar plates. So it consists of the two alar plates on each side, and the roof of this diencephalon, because of the developing cerebral hemispheres and their lateral outgrowths, the roof plate, it becomes thinned out and forms the lamina terminalis. The cavity of the diencephalon, the third ventricle, is in open communication with the cavity of the cerebral hemispheres, that is the lateral ventricle, through the interventricular foramina. The floor plate and the basal plates, they are absent in the diencephalon. Later on, the lateral wall of this diencephalon, it gives rise to the three swellings from the alar plate, that is the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. Now this epithalamus and the thalamus, they are separated by a sulcus which is called the epithalamic sulcus. And the second swelling, that is which will give rise to the thalamus later on, is separated from the lower or the caudal swelling, the hypothalamus, by the hypothalamic sulcus. Now this hypothalamic sulcus is not like the sulcus limitans, and it will not separate the alar or the basal plates. So these three swellings, they are formed from the alar plates, that is the epithalamus, the thalamus, and the hypothalamus. The thalamus is a ovoid structure of the gray matter which develops as a thickening of the alar plate in the lateral wall of the third ventricle, and it protrudes into the cavity of the third ventricle, and the two thalami on the each sides, they grows rapidly and they bulges into the cavity of the third ventricle, so that this cavity of the third ventricle, it obliterates and it remains in a slit like fashion. So it reduces and becomes a narrow cleft because of the developing thalami on each side. Later on, these two thalami of the right and the left cerebral hemispheres, they are connected in the 70% of the brain by the interthalamic adhesions. Now, these interthalamic adhesion, they are a bridge of the gray matter across the third ventricle in the midline. Later on, the caudal swelling in the alar plate is formed, which is called the hypothalamus, and it is separated from the thalamus by the hypothalamic sulcus. So you can see here that this is the caudal proliferation of the neuroblast in the lower part of the diencephalon and on each side of the third ventricle, and it is separated from the thalamus by the hypothalamic sulcus. Later on, this hypothalamus, it develops the nuclei which are concerned with the endocrine activities and the autonomic control. Uh, Later on, there is also another pea-sized swelling appears in the ventral surface of the hypothalamus. That is a pair of the nuclei which are called the mammillary body. Now, the epithalamus, as we have seen, that epithalamus arises from the dorsal part of the roof of the lateral wall of the diencephalon. So, this portion of the epithalamus is separated from the thalamus by the epithalamic sulcus. And you can see here that this is the swelling, large swelling of the epithalamus, and below is the thalamus, and which is separated the most caudal portion, that is the hypothalamus. So this swelling of the epithalamus is initially a large swelling, and later on it becomes a relatively a small swelling. Now, the pineal gland or the pineal body, it appears as a epithelial thickening in the midline, and by the seventh week of the development, it evaginates and becomes a solid organ at the roof of the mesencephalon. It will later on it will becomes a solid and forms the pineal body or the pineal gland, and the rest of the portion of the roof will form the choroid plexus of the third ventricle. You can see here that this is a developing pineal body in the roof of the diencephalon, and you can see here the adult structure, that is the pineal gland. This is an outgrowth of, and this is the thalamus, and separated from the hypothalamus by the hypothalamic sulcus, the mammillary body, and this is the optic chiasma, the infundibular recess, and these are all the structures of the adult structures of the diencephalon. So pineal gland is basically involved in the secretion of the melatonin, and it is involved in the sleep-wake cycle. Whereas the epithalamus, it is related with the swallowing functions. The thalamus, which is a ovoid gray matter, is a major relay station or the sensory input of the cerebral cortex. The hypothalamus, it's a master regulatory center, that is it controls the autonomic and the endocrine and the limbic functions. The hypophysis or the pituitary gland, which we'll discuss later on in the next lecture, it secretes the various hormones. The optic cup give rise to the retina of the eye, which also develops from the diencephalon. Now the third ventricle, which is the cavity of develops from the cavity of the diencephalon, and a small part of the from the telencephalon. And initially it is in wide communication with the telencephalon cavity, that is the lateral ventricle, through the interventricular foramen. So you can see here the surrounding structures, the thalamus on each side, and below is the hypothalamus, and these are the developing neurohypophyseal diverticula. And these are the choroid plexus in the roof of the third ventricle. So the roof plate of the diencephalon, it is thinned out, and it is made up of a single layer of the ependyma and covered by the vascular layer. So later on, and it forms the choroid plexus. And now you can see here that this cavity of the third ventricle, because of the closure of the midline union of these cerebral hemispheres, the cavity of the lateral ventricles, they are separated from the cavity of the third ventricle, and the choroid plexus, it develops in the roof, and it extends from the interventricular foramina to the habenular commissure. So this is the roof of the third ventricle, which extends from here, interventricular foramina, to the habenular commissure. So the boundaries of the third ventricle, this form anteriorly it formed by the lamina terminalis, laterally by the thalami on each side, and the floor is formed from the supraoptic recess on the superior surface of the optic chiasma to the infundibular recess, and above to the from the mammillary body to the aqueduct. So these are the boundaries of the third ventricle. So now you can see here the adult structure which is of the third ventricle, which is shown in the red, and this is the cavity which is found between the two thalami filled with the CSF, and it above it is connected through the to the lateral ventricle, which is the cavity of the cerebral hemispheres, and is C-shaped with the anterior and inferior horns, and then below it is connected through the cerebral aqueduct to the cavity of the fourth ventricle, and then to this canal which runs into the spinal cord. So this is how the CSF flows from the ventricular, showing you the ventricular system of the brain from the lateral ventricle to the third ventricle and to the fourth ventricle and then to the spinal canal. So this is all about the development of the diencephalon, and we'll discuss the later in the next lecture the pituitary gland and the cerebral commissure and the birth defects. Thank you.